Thank you very much for that warm introduction. Just so you know, I travelled up from Cornwall this morning. Took the plane up, and I did notice you were trending on Twitter. I think you were in the top 5 when I left Newquay Airport. I had some engagements in Cornwall on Thursday and Friday, and I've spoken to some businesses who are very, very positive about the opportunities that they're now presented with. I want to talk a bit today about fishing and what fishing might look like, but I'd like to take you back, if I may, to start off with. So Wednesday, the 15th of June, 2016. Not a day that many people will remember, but a day that will live long in my memory. Just a week before the EU referendum, I walked out of the House of Commons terrace to find a single solitary fishing boat bobbing around on the River Thames. Sitting just a few yards from the Houses of Parliament, its 2 or 3 men waved over to myself and a handful of MPs and researchers. Holding up their vote leave, bunting and flags and banners, they wanted their voices heard in the corridors of power. Away from the terrace and behind Parliament's thick stone walls, the Prime Minister began his, that seems like such a long time ago, the Prime Minister began his weekly question time session to a packed House of Commons chamber. Just a single boat of a few men would have been lucky enough to attract the attention of a few MPs and a few doorkeepers. I knew how important this issue was, so I left Prime Minister's questions. I know PMQs are important, but I wanted to be there to greet them and be ready when they came through. So as I looked down the river towards the London Eye, there appeared to be an armada of fishing boats coming towards us. Managing to dodge the river cruisers and ferries one by one, they slid under Westminster Bridge and emerged in the shadow of Big Ben. Onlookers at Westminster Bridge began to realise that they were going to see a water-based protest, and I don't think they've ever seen anything quite like what happened. Wasn't your bog standard protest that we tend to see in Parliament Square. Many of us in Westminster are familiar with. It was a fleet of fishing trawlers powering out the Thames. A throng of fishing boats were now huddled there. More and more MPs and parliamentary staff began to gather after Prime Minister's questions. They began to unfurl their vote leave banners on the terrace to show an act of solidarity to our many, many fishermen who steamed hundreds and hundreds of miles to be there on that day. Many people walking the streets of London would probably have never seen a fishing trawler before, let alone a whole fleet of them. And it's easy for metropolitan areas like London sometimes to take their food for granted, where it comes from and how it gets onto the table. For many that day, it would have been the first time they'd actually seen the person that catches their cod, haddock, salmon and lobsters. These brave souls, they go out in the harshest of weathers to ensure that they earn their living and put food on all of our plates. If that wasn't hard enough, they've had to contend with the suffocating rules that has been laid down to them under the Common Fisheries Policy that has absolutely decimated their industry. It was then, when the foot trawlers were all assembled outside, that this huge white vessel emerged from under the arches of Westminster Bridge. Music blaring from the top decks and people shouting and jeering down at the fishermen. They held their in-crowd posters. Amongst them, a small group of metropolitan lovies and Bob Geldof. Yelling down the microphone as he tried to show some alternative facts about the fishing industry. Apparently, the UK had some of the most generous quotas. Apparently, the Common Fisheries Policy hadn't decimated our fishing industry at all. Here we have a group of fishermen who sacrificed their day at sea to instead leave their communities and travel to London to make the public know and the politicians that the EU was ruining their lives and their industry. They got sold down the river by Ted Heath in the 70s. Those late night discussions about fishing, they were completely let down, and it's time that we put the rudder in the water and showed them that we were going to change direction. As the fishermen continued to hold their Brexit banners, we saw the real contempt from the people that were just a few yards away as they threw verbal insults and stuck fingers up at them. For me, that was probably the abiding image that will resonate for me of the EU referendum. It showed the separation between metropolitan London and the rural salt of the earth communities of our great nation. It summed up beautifully the areas of the country that have benefited from globalisation and those that have been left behind. Their lives have been ruined and ruled by unelected commissioners and bureaucrats that impinge on every aspect of it. And thankfully, a week later, the fishermen who sailed up the Thames and the many others up and down our great nation were vindicated when we woke on that night of the 24th of June. Incredible, absolutely incredible. When we saw those results coming in from Sunderland, it was quite something. Anyway, I want to tell you a bit about me. So I grew up in a coastal community. I've seen this thriving fishing industry. I grew up in North Cornwall. I'm a fisherman, an angler, not a kind of boat fisherman, but an angler. My dad built boats for a living. As many of you might know, I also worked for the Royal Mail for 20 years. So I'm what Theresa May describes as kind of the working class conservative. Throughout the EU referendum, we heard numerous times from Remain campaigners in Cornwall that Cornwall would lose the tens of millions of pounds of funding that it received from Brussels. Aside from the fact that the current funding programme was due to end in 2020 anyway, the EU hadn't hinted at any future funding. They failed to mention that this was actually British taxpayers' money recycled back to us with extra strings attached. Of course, the assumption that the current funding would disappear was fiction, as was the rhetoric around EU meltdown and the Third World War. Does anybody remember the Third World War stuff? What wasn't fiction, though, was the heinous way in which many of our Cornish fishermen and fishermen throughout the whole of the country have been treated under the Common Fisheries Policy. It's easy to sit in a campaign office in Westminster and spout the virtues of being a member of the EU, but go down to an actual fishing community on the coast of Cornwall and see the real effects of our membership over the last 4 decades. Knock on a few doors, speak to a few members of the family who used to make a living at sea. They'll tell you how hard it's been under a policy where our politicians have to go into a room and argue for quotas in our own waters. For that fact, and for decades, fishing grounds have been overrun with foreign trawlers carrying huge quotas. Funny enough, this wasn't mentioned in the Remain literature. The total number of fishing boats in the UK has fallen from 20,000 in the mid-90s down to just 12,000 now. The number of our fishing vessels in the UK has fallen by 28% since 1996. It's shameful that we have a situation where fishermen were paid to burn their boats and their livelihoods. You don't have to travel far along the Cornish coastline to find a fishing community. Of course, we still see boats bobbing around, but the vibrancy of those communities has gradually been diminished over the years. Cornwall produces a fantastic quality of fish, and I have a vision that we might be able to sell that around the world and market it as being the best quality produce that we can get. I've kind of marketing the Waitrose of the world thing with the farming community. I think some of our welfare standards that we have in the UK are second to none, and people do want that premium product. However, at the moment, the amount of fish that our fishermen have been able to claim has been reduced, and we now find ourselves having to preserve certain species because the EU policy has dangerously overfished them. That's why a British fisheries policy will also serve the interests of conservation as well as commerce. Now that we've voted to leave, we can think about how we deal with quotas, how we deal with the harsh regulations of the Common Fisheries Policy applied to our fishermen who ridiculously had to throw their fish back into the sea, and look forward to getting out of the Common Fisheries Policy and giving our fishermen their territorial waters back once again. In the months since the referendum, the Remainers have continued to put forward ideas of soft Brexit by wanting to stay in the single market. Wanting to stay in a single market but having no place at the table is the worst possible deal we could get. There's no such thing as soft or hard Brexit. There's either leaving the European Union or staying in, and we've made our decision. Thankfully, the Prime Minister has confirmed that she'll be ceasing membership of the single market with no half-in, half-out arrangement, but seeking the best possible access to that market. We can now look forward to an end to the common fisheries policy and the beginning of a British fisheries policy that's accountable to Parliament and to Whitehall. That said, although I want to see our fishermen and our British trawlers put first and have the lion's share of the quota, we should not turn our back on our fishing friends from across the Channel. There is no problem in providing British waters that are managed by British authorities and not Brussels. I'll give you an example. British vessels land around 40,000 tonnes of fish in the UK each year, but between 200 and 300,000 of those tonnes are actually landed in the EU. My view is that the best deal for the UK would be to bring all that quota back to the UK. So we have control of the quota, control of the processing, and control of the export market. And if we do that as a start, then I think we will be in a good place. I'm sure we can come to an agreement with our British fishermen about getting a fair deal for our waters while allowing access to European boats in the interim. However, there must be red lines in our negotiations, and those red lines must include freedom of movement of people and return to British territorial waters. Any request from Brussels to maintain freedom of movement or shared fishing grounds under a European authority must not be accepted. Once we leave the EU, it will be imperative for our fishermen to be put first, and we'll have proper policies and authorities in place to make sure that our stocks are managed better, that quotas are fairer, and that the industry can grow and thrive. We have seen a lot of our fishermen are getting older and older, and we don't have that kind of young resource coming in much the same way as the farming community. And I've recently written to the Minister for Agriculture and said, we do need to have a policy in place to ensure that young people can get into this industry. At the moment, the Common Fisheries Policy is ensuring that landings in the UK are down by 7% year on year. And the value of those landings are down 11% in real terms from 1994. There are emerging markets now all over the world, and we can take advantage of those through the Department of Trade and look at how we can put the fishermen's catches in Cornwall and around the rest of the country on the plate of people all around the world. The UK is a net importer of fish, and net imports stood at 238,000 tonnes in 2015. Of course, there'll be varying types of fish and shellfish that we have to import, but it's absurd that we have to import fish when they're in our own waters. I don't get that. Just as an aside, I'll let you into a little bit of a secret. So I'm a parliamentary species champion for the European sea bass, okay? We can all get allocated a species in Parliament, and my one is the sea bass, and you know the RSPB have given me that designation. If you prefer not the sea bass, you can say the Detractus chubus labarax. That's the first time you'll ever hear a Cornishman speak in Latin. The European species, the European bass is an important commercial species, but it's also important to recreational anglers as well, because of their fighting prowess. Evidence has shown there has been a decline in population. In 2010, the quantity of bass at breeding age was 15 tonnes, but in 2014 it was estimated that it will be down to 11 to 12 tonnes. That's the result of dangerous overfishing under the Common Fisheries Policy. In 2014, the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea recommended that bass management plans were put in place to reduce fish mortality. Consequently, the number of emergency measures were introduced to try and maintain the stocks, including commercial trawler bans and 3-bag limits for recreational anglers. Despite these measures, in 2015, in June, the Council once again warned about depleting bass stocks. They advised that landings by commercial and recreational anglers should be no more than 541 tonnes in central, South North Sea, Ireland, the English Channel and the Bristol channels. Now in 2017, we are once again seeing big restrictions on how many bass can be landed. The sea bass is a wonderful species, but it's been let down by the European Union. And it's important that this one-size approach that fits all to fishing just does not work. It's vital that we get Britain out of this suffocation of regulation. The plight of the bass cannot be cured overnight. But I look forward to a day when Britain can actually lead the way and say, we don't want your EU regulation. We want to implement our own policies and our own protections to ensure that this fish's survival. A domestic fisheries policy needs to address the plight of the bass and other species that have suffered under the common fisheries policy. For bass specifically, we need to see greater emphasis on restriction of commercial fishing until the stocks maintain a sensible level again. Bass stocks could benefit from hook and line fisheries and recreational angling, which could add another dimension to our tourism businesses in Cornwall. From a commercial point of view, both stock increases and added value that you would get from line-caught bass could open up huge markets. By having policies which are made and implemented in Britain, we can look at ways of preventing foreign trawlers from coming in and protecting the species which are under threat. I'll let you into a bit of a secret. In Cornwall, we had had lots of bass populations, and what tended to happen was that the foreign boats would wait just outside our 6-mile limit. We control everything up to the 6-mile limit, and they'll be waiting just outside. And when these fish were going to spawn, they would then end up netting these fish that are just going out to reproduce. Absolutely incredible. I want to touch for a moment on discards. This is one of the biggest issues in fishing. It's controversial. We currently find ourselves in a situation whereby fishermen are throwing fish back into the sea, even when they're dead. And that's often because they have no quota, because the quotas in the UK are too small. The House of Commons Environmental, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee found that approximately 1.7 million tonnes of fish were discarded annually, corresponding to 23% of the total catch of all fish. In some fisheries, discard rates had been as much as 90% of the catches. We can't see perfectly good dead fish thrown back into the sea. And I was pleased to see the UK take the lead in Brussels by introducing a discard ban where fishermen can target pelagic species such as mackerel and herring and having to land everything that they catch within those nets. I know Owen Patterson recently talked about introducing days at sea, where fishermen apply for the number of days that they fish at sea and then they land everything they catch. I think that's a much more sensible approach. Although I welcome measures that have been introduced to address discards, this, like I said to you before, this one-size-fits-all approach does not suit us. We need this British fisheries policy, and we need it to do the things that around sustainable fishing and where fishermen are not scared to catch fish and bring them back ashore. Of course, we want to deter fishermen from catching more than the permitted amount, but there must be a mechanism in place whereby we can deal with that. I want to talk to you for a moment about an idea that I have. Farmers have been incentivised under their common agricultural policy to do some things around environmental protections. And I'm not embarrassed to say that I do like some environmental protections. I think some of the wildlife management things that farmers have put in place have been very good. And I want to throw something out there for fishing specifically. Many of you will have seen the Sky campaign around ocean plastics, the documentary that highlighted the problem of small granular plastics getting into the seas and getting into the food chain. I believe that there could be a British fisheries policy that could incentivise plastics being removed from our oceans. I call it the Fishing for Plastic scheme, and we're fortunate enough to see these huge amounts of these fishermen are seeing these huge plastic reservations in the seas, and they're not able to actually do anything about it. Cornwall's surrounded by water, and we rely heavily on the attractions of our beaches. The last thing I want to see as a Cornishman and a local MP is for visitors to arrive in Cornwall and be welcomed by a pile of plastic bottles on our beaches and floating carrier bags in the ocean. The 5p carrier bag charge has seen huge reductions in the number of bags used. But bags are only one element of the answer. And we should consider how we can implement a fishery scheme that allows fishermen to bring back the plastics they actually catch. We are currently in a position where if a fisherman was to go out to sea and bring plastics back aboard, many local authorities actually charge him for handling that plastic and putting it back into the system. It's completely idiotic. So we wrote to the minister about this, and we've already raised this. We want to see this as part of our fishing policy. It could be incentivization for a number of different things, but I think primarily it could be through a cash incentive, it could be through a fuel incentive, it could be through resources, or even quota. There's a number of ways that we could kind of implement something like this that could work for everyone. And you know, the fishermen shouldn't just take, they should try and give something back. And I think by implementing a policy like this, we can clean up our oceans. Fishermen wouldn't be forced to collect plastic, but they would be incentivized to do it. So I'm going to wind up, I'm going to conclude, and then I'm going to take some questions. I want to say to you, conference, I believe in Britain. I believe we're on the right track. I believe that our trade and our skills and our policies will put us in a global marketplace, and we will do well. We must never again allow communities up and down our great nation to become excluded through global markets. To quote our fabulous Prime Minister, we need trade and commerce to work for absolutely everyone in this country. I've got one final line. I stand with our fishermen, and I'll be fighting to ensure that they get the red, white and blue Brexit that they demanded by our sovereign parliament. Thank you very much.